So yesterday I did the most underrated player on every team video, so if you have not checked that out, I'd appreciate it if you did. But of course, we also have to talk about the most overrated player on every team. To be fair, for this video, I just want to highlight that a lot of these guys are players that I specifically overrated, and I don't even necessarily think are all that overrated by the league at large. There are definitely cases of that, but yeah, just to be clear, a lot of these are guys that I was just a little too high on, and I kind of regret that. Hello everybody, welcome to Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already and drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and makes a massive difference on how this video performs in the YouTube algorithm. So just like last time, we're going to be going in alphabetical order, starting with the Atlanta Hawks, and the player that I picked for them was Clint Capella. The angle in which these players are under or overrated can be kind of different. It can be a franchise overrated, it can be from me, it can be from a fan base, whatever it may be. In the case of Clint, it's definitely overrated by his own franchise. The fact that he has not been kicked to the curb for Onyeka Okongwu at this point is absolutely absurd, and he is quite deserving of being on a different team at this point. Onyeka, I think, just has way more upside. He's younger, he's cheaper. I don't understand why they refuse to let the crutch of Clint Capella go away. For the Boston Celtics, this will come as no surprise to anyone who watches this channel a lot. I went with Jaylen Brown. That said, I don't really think anyone in Boston is that dramatically overrated anymore. Jaylen was in the past, but as we discussed in a recent Hot Takes, the pendulum has kind of swung in the other direction where I don't think he's that overrated. I still think there's a smidge overrated because there is still way too many people who think that Jaylen is like legitimately an all-NBA caliber player, and he's just not. He made it one time because the players and his teammates and coaching staff inflated his numbers so he could get a bigger contract. In reality, the player that he is this year, which is like a 22-point-per-game scorer on solid defense and solid efficiency, that's what Jaylen Brown is, and that's perfectly fine. But people continually, even still after last year, put him in conversations he just does not belong in. For the Brooklyn Nets, I went with Mikal Bridges. This is another case of overrated by his franchise specifically, because goddamn the trades that they have turned down for this guy. Let me tell you, doesn't make any damn sense. I'm not even gonna bother going down the list, but like there's multiple picks that have been offered. I think Jalen Green was offered, plus a bunch of their own draft picks. Stupid deals to be turning down for a guy who is like 27 years old. For the Charlotte Hornets, I went with Miles Bridges because fuck that guy. For the Chicago Bulls, I went with DeMar DeRozan, and the reason why I believe that DeMar is overrated isn't because he's not good, because a lot of people think that he is good rightfully, but because it is under-mentioned, under-discussed how his play style is really counterintuitive to modern hoops, and that makes him a ridiculously difficult player to build around and a ridiculously difficult player to have as a secondary or third option. So you either have DeMar be a terrible first option, or he just doesn't really work as a second and especially third option. So it's really just kind of hard to find a place for him in the NBA. It's a case of like being really talented but not being portable, which just means, you know, being able to fit in many different contexts. And when I'm just thinking about what DeMar DeRozan's free agent market looks like this upcoming season, because he likely will leave the Chicago Bulls, but it's not as likely just because there's not a lot of teams in the league who necessarily need the type of production that he can give them, either because he doesn't work as a secondary, or again, they have a better option for their first guy. For the Cleveland Cavaliers, I decided to go with Evan Mobley. To be fair, he has been better ever since returning from injury, but in general, he is a guy who was getting Tim Duncan comparisons pretty early into his career, and I think there's just no shot he's gonna quite live up to that. Defensively, sure, I think Evan Mobley could win 1, 2, maybe even 3 if the cards are played in his favor, Defensive Player of the Year awards. But offensively, he's just never going to be anywhere near what peak Tim Duncan was. And in general, it feels like he's made only marginal improvements offensively speaking. For the Dallas Mavericks, this is another player who is overrated by me. That is Jaden Hardy. To be fair, I keep saying that, but to be fair in this case, he hasn't been as big of a prominent member of the rotation ever since Kyrie Irving's gotten there. It only makes sense that they don't really need more shot-creating guards. They already kind of got a plethora of that. So he kind of just fell in the rotation as a result of that, but he also has not been as good in the more limited minutes. It's hard to be consistent in an inconsistent role, but I definitely projected probably a little bit too much on the guy. Like, I genuinely thought he could be a star player, but I'm kind of more like, good quality sixth man is where I'm leaning now. Another player, yet again, that I overrated myself, Zeke Naji. I really thought he could be a good rotation player for Denver, and they clearly thought that too because they gave him a 3-year, I think $24 million contract extension. But since then, he's kind of fallen out of the rotation. He is not an effective small ball center like it seemed like he could be before. It just doesn't really look like he should be in the NBA, or if he is, he's like a 14th, 15th man, when I truly thought he could have been one of the first guys off of the bench for them. With the Detroit Pistons, I decided to go with James Wiseman. I have been a James Wiseman hater forever. He has been playing more like an actual NBA player for a stretch recently, but he's still not a guy who's going to be in the league for very long. Perfect example of, honestly, something that I didn't think was going to happen in the NBA anymore, but it did. A guy who just has extremely impressive physical profile, but nothing else to bank on. A very Hasheem the Beat type draft pick here. But hell, at least Hasheem had like crazy defensive numbers in college. James played like 3 games. For the Golden State Warriors, I'm gonna go with Draymond Green. It wasn't really easy to make a pick for them, but Draymond, I think, at least at this stage in his career, there's been times where his stupid bullshit Draymond antics has been worth what he brings to the table. But lately, even though he still proves to have a positive impact in terms of like metrics and playmaking and defense and all that, it also just feels like it's getting closer and closer and closer to just not worth it to deal with his bullshit. And that's a damn shame because I think Draymond is historically an underrated player. But in terms of where he is right now, I would definitely put him firmly in the overrated. For the Houston Rockets, I'm going with Alperen Sengun. I hope you guys won't kill me for that one because I truly do not have anything against him. I just don't love offensive centers who aren't ridiculously good at offense, while Sengun is a good offensive player, no doubt. And I could see an all-star appearance or 2 in his future, but I don't necessarily see a future perennial all-star, and I surely do not see Nikola Jokic 2.0. That, I think, is just a stretch too far. And I wonder as well, like, they've done a lot of their winning after Sengun was out, and Jalen Green got a lot better after Sengun was out. Actually getting those two to work together is kind of pivotal for the future of that franchise, because they haven't had the best synergy before this. This is just because I have to pick somebody. I don't really think anybody on Houston is that overrated. I think there's actually either 1 or 2 teams on here that I literally put nobody for. They were not one of them, though. Miles Turner for the Indiana Pacers, simply overrated just because his defensive reputation is a little over the top from what he actually brings to the table. It's kind of always struck me as one of those guys who's like a good shot blocker, but how good he is defensively kind of varies based on matchups and how much effort he's really putting in. I do think that Indiana's scheme has put him in the worst position defensively of his career, so he's probably playing the worst defense of his career for that reason, but again, I don't think that's really his fault too much, and the Pacers have gotten better at defense as the season has gone along, but nevertheless, I think he's overrated because his defense is just not that great, not as good as a lot of people think, and I think if it was as good as people think, Indiana would be a better defensive team. For the Los Angeles Clippers, I am going to go with Terrence Mann. I understand in terms of an offense-defense balance why Terrence starts over Norman Powell, but in terms of what the closing lineup should be, it should pretty much always be Norman Powell unless he's having an off night or you just need the defensive matchup difference there. But otherwise, Terrence Mann is probably one of the worst players in their entire rotation, and that's with him being a starter at that. I honestly had really high hopes for Terrence Mann, and it just did not work out, really. Speaking of that, for the Los Angeles Lakers, Christian Wood, another player that I overrated and wanted to point that out. I actually saw a video come across my algorithm the other day. It was like a 3-4-year-old video about Christian Wood. It was a couple of players, so it was like an underrated players video. And the thumbnail was a silhouette of Christian Wood, and then the next Anthony Davis ? In text. Probably should have been a little bit more questioning of that, because no, he is not the next Anthony Davis. Aesthetically, his offensive game can appear similar in many ways to a younger Pelicans Anthony Davis who's more mobile than current AD. But yeah, he's far from AD. His defense is atrocious, and then offensively speaking, he's become more and more inconsistent. really kind of a black hole on offense in general, complete non-playmaker. It's just rough, man. It's a guy who has a lot of skill, but could not be skilled in the right areas to actually be a consistent, good NBA player. For the Memphis Grizzlies, I'm going with Zaire Williams simply because I really don't think that he should be a rotational guy for them anymore. Obviously, right now it's fine because the Grizzlies fucking suck and who else is going to play. But in terms of a guy being a part of their future, I just do not see it with him where a lot of people have otherwise. He has games where you see the vision for what he can be, a tall, long wing who's really athletic. But his three ball's really inconsistent. Really everything about him's inconsistent. I would just rather see a franchise like the Grizzlies not put so much time into projects. Again, this year, it's fine. Might as well do project stuff. But when this team's serious about winning, when everyone's healthy, that dude should not be in the rotation. For the Miami Heat, I am going with Tyler Hero, and that's really just because I think the archetype of player that Tyler is one that is routinely overrated, and that is the almost exclusively jump shot and not great playmaking guard. Tyler Hero is a pretty solid playmaker, don't get me wrong, but he's not a great one. Does a lot of shot creation for someone who doesn't really get to the rim, does a lot of ball handling for someone who doesn't really get to the rim like that. He's not a non-factor driving, but he's definitely a very jump shot happy player. Those guys are just more prone to an inconsistency. He is also, of course, not much of a factor on the defensive end of the floor, so unless he's just scorching hot on his jumper, it makes it a lot harder for him to impact the game, which just makes him kind of inherently worse than I think a lot of people give him credit for that reason. Ultimately, that consistency is really important, and it's just not there regularly with him. And we've seen with him in the past, him like getting played off of the floor in the postseason because like the defense trade-off is just not worth the inconsistent offense. Speaking of inconsistent offense, Damian Lillard, an all-star starter this year? Suck my dick. No fucking way, man. That was ridiculous. Damian Lillard fell off a lot this year. Still good. Still borderline worthy of an all-star discussion. But man, he's coasting on reputation right now. I feel like if Dame wasn't Dame, if he was just any other player who put up the numbers that he did, there'd be a lot more conversation about him being But, you know, he still gets the Damian Lillard reputation that bolsters him very high in the NBA rankings for a lot of people. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, I went with Kyle Anderson. This was another thing where it's like, how the fuck am I going to pick a player on the Timberwolves who's really overrated like that? People don't really talk about him even when they are good. Kyle's probably, I think, their worst rotational player, and in the postseason, his non-factor from shooting from outside thing with him consistently drudges up. I don't think he's like that overrated though. I think he just probably should play a little bit less. I think Chris Finch probably thinks a little too highly of him. Really good defender, good playmaker, but his scoring just sucks a lot. For the New Orleans Pelicans, I am going with Jonas Valanciunas. I think that Jonas is easily the weakest link in their entire rotation. They're one of the deepest teams in the league. However, they do not have a very good backup center, nor do they have a very good starting center. Something that Rudy has described Jonas Valanciunas as in the past when he was a member of the Memphis Grizzlies is that he's kind of like training wheels, which is that he's a floor raiser, but also kind of a ceiling capper. It's better just not to have Jonas on your team unless you're kind of like going through a stage of your development where you want that consistency, but don't mind having a cap because you're not going to get that far anyways. But when you're the Pelicans and you have Zion and Ingram and CJ and you have the depth that they do, the wings, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, it would just be better to start any regular center that's not going to be a post-up guy, not going to take weird jumpers and just be have concrete shoes essentially on defense. It's just not ideal. Honestly, I said they don't have a great backup center. Larry Nance Jr. is a pretty solid one. Honestly, the fact that he has that mobility on defense and he's going to take less shots on offense, you might actually see the Pelicans going to him more and more. Valanciunas, I think, is a regular season player who isn't even all that great in the first place. For the New York Knicks, I went with Josh Hart. Kind of another one, a little difficult to make a pick here, but offensively, his shooting is just terrible. I feel bad though, because like he literally does everything else super well. Man, sometimes the fact that he can't shoot really hurts them. More often than not, it's not a huge deal, but you know, the Knicks can have a tendency to just have games where they are shitting the bed, more or less. So yeah, Josh Hart being another non-shooter for them, not good, but the rebounding, the defense, the playmaking as well, all that stuff's great. I like Josh Hart a lot. His three ball was going in more with the Knicks his first stint there after he got traded. So a little bit of a fall off there. He's really not that overrated. For the OKC Thunder, I'm going with Josh Giddey, and this is a player that is overrated by his own franchise, I think. I think when the postseason comes around, Josh, if not being cut from the rotation entirely, should at the very least be no more than a 20-minute per game guy, and they should have someone else in that starting lineup, or at the very least someone else playing more minutes than him. Whether that's Isaiah Joe, whether that's Aaron Wiggins, whether that's Cason Wallace, somebody that's not Josh Giddey, somebody that will hit their threes, somebody that will be a more positive defender. His playmaking and sometimes decent inside the arc scoring, it's just not worth it. For the Orlando Magic, I'm going with Cole Anthony. This is another case of like just archetype of player that I do not care for. Shot creating small guard who isn't much of a playmaker and a non-factor defensively for the most part. He's not a terrible defender, especially for being a small guy, but he's not a great one. And I routinely feel as though he's interrupting the flow of their offense. He's just not that great, unfortunately. It seemed like he might actually prove some doubters wrong because he went lower in the draft than he was originally projected before his college season started. But I don't know, he's kind of been exactly who everyone thought he'd be, which is a mediocre shot-creating guard. For the Sixers, I'm going to go with Tobias Harris. Frankly, this is another one that was a little bit overrated by me because I feel like I thought he was more solid than he is, where lately I've started to feel he's more and more just like actually shit. He's not always, and he can still score pretty well, but he's kind of bad at making the right reads on offense. Despite being a big forward, he's never more than just an okay defender. He has games where his shooting is just completely disappears from him. So yeah, Tobias Harris. For the Phoenix Suns, I went with Kevin Durant. I'm a Kevin Durant hater. I'll always be a Kevin Durant hater. He is not a top 5 player in the NBA, and the fact that he's not a great first franchise leading option from a leadership perspective or a playstyle perspective is one of the many reasons why the Phoenix Suns are pretty disappointing this year based on what a lot of people expected for them. But honestly, I'm more or less not surprised by them being bad for that reason. For the Portland Trailblazers, DeAndre Ayton is another player that I overrated. I truly thought that he was going to be good in Portland, and he was not. Better lately than he was to start the year. He was really bad to start the year because apparently he was sleeping on a fucking air mattress. Since then, he has been a little bit better, a little more respectable. Either way, not going to be the all-star tier guy that I thought he might be able to turn his career around into being in Portland. I'm just not really seeing it anymore. I decided to go with nobody for the Sacramento Kings. I also went with nobody for the Toronto Raptors because really nobody on this team is being overrated. I think there are a couple of players on both of these teams that, if anything, are underrated. So yeah, nobody for those two teams. For the San Antonio Spurs, I decided to go with Jeremy Sohan. Admittingly, he's been better since I was more critical of him to start the year, especially just because he's been in a role that makes more sense for him than being the starting point guard. I truly can't even believe that even happened to begin with. But honestly, he seems like he's just going to be a non-factor from outside. His percentages aren't the worst, but his form is bad, and his attempts, his volume is low. I don't know. If he can be a decent, consistent three-point shooter, he's definitely going to be in the NBA. But in terms of being like a really good player, actually, yeah, he's at 31% from three. Forget that, what I said. Yeah, unless he can become just a respectable enough three-point shooter, everything else that he does everything else fairly well. It's not gonna matter. You truly cannot just be a complete non-factor from outside unless you're dominating in other areas, and he's good to fine in other areas. You know, he's a good playmaker, he's a good defender, he's a fine finisher. He's fine in general inside the arc. He's a fine rebounder. You need to be more than just fine to a little good at a couple of things if one of the things you're going to be bad at, especially as an off-ball player, is shooting. And I feel like that is just something that routinely people are like, well, he does X, Y, and Z. That's cool, but if three-point shooting isn't one of those three things, then I don't really want to hear it. For the Utah Jazz, I'm going to go with John Collins. I don't really feel like people are overrating him these days, but he kind of was historically, and it was really hard to pick anybody else, so I guess John Collins, that could be another nobody one there. Last but not least, with the Washington Wizards, another player that I personally overrated, Landry Shamet. Made all-rookie second team in his first year, and that was the peak of his career. That's really fucking disappointing, and as a guy who is a three-point shooter, hasn't even been a very good three-point shooter. So yeah, that's a big L. I also thought he could put up better numbers on the Wizards with more opportunity, but if anything, his numbers have declined with more opportunity. That's it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.